You'll have a small group here, but I mean, like you said, small group, big group, it's just awesome to have you here today. So I'm going to turn it over to you and let you give your own introduction. And most of you know who I am. I'm Elisa Weist. I'm the program manager at the Senior Center. And yeah, you know, we're in 2021 and we're still going virtual, and we'll always be going virtual in the future. And I'm excited about new opportunities and just continuing to learn throughout this year. So over to you, Kevin.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone able to join us. And for those watching on YouTube afterwards, thank you for tuning in. We're going to have a little bit of a discussion today. It's going to be a mix of a discussion and lecture and kind of just an informal presentation, if you will. I always like to say that history isn't a passive experience. The studying of history is very active. You're meant to engage in conversation. We're meant to have a discussion. We're meant to learn from each other. That's how you study history. That's what history is understanding other people and trying to understand other people. And I think hopefully doing this in more of a conversational way, and also kind of giving us a little more context of what we're celebrating, or not celebrating, commemorating is more appropriate this month, because of course, for those of you that are aware, this month, January of 2021, is the 30th anniversary of the beginning of Operation Desert Storm. Of course, we'll talk a little bit about the timeline, because I really want to put it into context, because today in particular, January 14th, 2021, is the 30th anniversary of the night before the ultimatum expired. The UN resolution ultimatum expires on January 15th, 1991. And that then, of course, leads to the combat operations that we know, 2020, and in hindsight, 2020, will begin this weekend, if you will. So we're going to talk a little bit about context. We're going to talk a little bit about how do we study history? How do we understand history? How do we interpret history? Because that's my job, and that'll also be part of my intro. And we're going to talk about the Veterans Museum. Hopefully you've had a chance to visit the Veterans Museum before. If you haven't, I'm going to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do and where we are. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about Wisconsin stories. There's only a couple I've thrown in here at the end, because I've found actually with this lecture that I get right up to the edge of the clock. So I'm going to encourage everyone that this will be the context, and to join us for our future programs through January and February at the museum, or virtually through the museum, to hear the individual stories. Because there's going to be a whole series of blog posts. There'll be discussions, curator conversations, I like to say, is one of our programs. And that's really where it's just myself and a few other staff members, or the director usually, who's also a historian. And we just talk about history, and we just kind of rip back and forth a little bit and see, or riff back and forth and see where the conversation will take us. So with that, I will do my best to share the right screen of the 7 tabs that I have open, and then do my best to get to the presentation mode. You guys still see the title page, right? Perfect. You don't see my notes. Even better. Small victories in this day and age. All right. So as I said, my name is Kevin Hampton. I'm the curator of history at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. I know everyone thinks it's a really cool title, curator of history. It is a cool title. I'm the historian on staff, but I'm also the exhibit designer. I do a lot of educational programming development, and I also do essentially a little bit of everything. So I do education programs, exhibits, and history and collections work as well. So it's kind of a jack of all trades, if you will. Hopefully everyone's heard of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum before. And if you haven't, perhaps you might remember us as the Grand Army of the Republic Memorial Hall. We were the Grand Army of the Republic Memorial Hall that was in the Capitol building from 1901 up until roughly, well, about 1990. It was actually 1989 that we started negotiating for a new building, an actual new location. We were in the Rotunda for a very long time, though. Perhaps if anyone had visited the Capitol building in the probably 60s, 70s, 80s, you might have seen even the flags, the Civil War battle flags on display in the Rotunda. That was kind of the premiere of our collection, if you will. That's the genesis of our collection. It was the Civil War veterans themselves that actually started this museum, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. But we are an educational activity of the Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs. So we are run by the state. We are the state's museum dedicated to preserving Wisconsin veteran stories. This is a fun photograph. We're going to talk a little bit about photographs too. I love photographs and digging into the details of photographs. And in this photo from the original GAR Memorial Hall, you can see a lot of stuff. You can see a lot of photographs framed there. You can see a flag perhaps in the back there. That's actually the flag of Company C of the 8th Wisconsin, which became the company that, or which was the company that brought Old Abe the War Eagle, if you're familiar with that mascot, down to Madison to join the 8th, the Wisconsin. So their field, their canton of blue, you'll see there, actually you can just make out the wing of an eagle instead of stars. It's really small, and someday you'll have to have me back, and I can tell you, I can do a Civil War program or something. We can go into details of photographs and all, because it's really fun. But to go along with that, you actually might notice the framed feathers of the original Old Abe, the War Eagle, above the portrait there, just above the chairs. Those are the remaining feathers of Old Abe. Of course, as we know, Old Abe unfortunately didn't survive captivity. He did survive the war, and went through many battles, but he didn't survive captivity, as he had an apartment down in the basement of the Capitol. We were, of course, in the rotunda of the Capitol, and Old Abe had the apartment in the basement. And unfortunately, during the first Capitol fire, he inhaled too much smoke, and he died about a month later. But he was such an iconic image that they stuffed him, put him back on display in the Capitol, and he burned down with the second Capitol fire. So either way, unfortunately, Old Abe didn't make it in his entirety. But we do have his feathers still that were droppings in his apartment. There's a great story. There's a lot of great stories about Old Abe, but again, you'll have to have me back for a Civil War program someday, because those are a lot of fun. So as I mentioned, we were established in 1901 by Civil War veterans themselves. It was the Civil War veterans that petitioned the state for their own museum to tell their story. And our mission still remains the same after all these years, after over 125 years almost. 125? Was it 125? No, not yet. Almost 125. We will be soon. Math was never my strong suit. Historian, what are you going to do? But our mission still is to acknowledge, commemorate, and affirm the role of Wisconsin veterans in the United States of America's military past and present. That is our mission in state statute. So that is what we will do. That is what we always will do. And that is what we will continue to do from here on out. The very first curator of history, if you will, the very first curator, or what they called a caretaker at the time, was Hosea Rude. He was actually a veteran of the Civil War, like I mentioned. He was the first curator. In one of his letters in 1910, this is kind of what we've adopted as our own calling, our own internal mission. In one of his letters, in one of his statements, I guess, I don't know if it was a letter or if it was a speech, he really kind of said it the best of what we're called to do as an institution. And it's the last lingering desire of these old veterans, so far as their country is concerned, is that they may leave it enshrined in the hearts of the young men and women who are so being educated as to become leaders of thought and purpose in their day and generation, and that they shall transmit an intelligent love of country to those of generations yet to come. Now, that doesn't necessarily encompass everything that we want to do. That's not necessarily encompass all that we hope to achieve, but I think it gives us a great grounding in what the original purpose of this institution was, and we hopefully live up to that understanding today. So my job at the Veterans Museum is to help convey that intelligent love of country, to help convey those stories. And one way to do that is to find ways to really frame the conversation of history. And for us, one of the best ways to do that for me personally is to understand that every veteran is a story. There was a debate, I won't lie, among staff, whether it should have been every veteran is a story or every veteran has a story. But that's a grammatical issue. Again, historians, don't blame us. But either way, every veteran is a story. And that's something that we really, truly believe at the Veterans Museum. If you've ever heard me talk before, you'll hear me say it again. It's the faces behind the facts that matter. It's that humanity behind the history that helps us understand and come to an understanding of what do these great historical events mean and why should we care? Another way that we're doing this in new interpretive storytelling is by reinforcing that Wisconsin was there. When you think of history, you think of these great moments in history. Think of especially military history, you think of the battles, the tanks, the planes, you think of all these things in the history books that you quickly read either in 6th grade or 8th grade or high school, or perhaps even today. Not often do you think of what it means in sheer volume of numbers. You look at the statistics of how many people serve. For instance, for today's conversation, we have 10,400 from Wisconsin that serve in the Persian Gulf War. Well, what does that mean? Each person had a story. Each person has their own history, has their own personality, their own likes, dislikes. And if we can connect with that on a human level, it can be so much more impactful when we study history. So we're going to talk a little bit about Wisconsin was there today as well. And of course, if you have had a chance to visit us, you'll recognize this building. This is what I was mentioning before. This is our Veterans Museum. We are right there on the corner of State Street at the top of Capitol Square, or the top of State Street at the corner there of Carroll Street. And you can see just over there is State Street going down to the left. Our galleries cover everything from the Civil War to current day. Important to note that when I mentioned that we were in the Capitol until 1989, the new museum opened just after actually the Persian Gulf War ended in 1991, and then another 1993. So there's originally the interpretive arc of our museum covered Civil War to current day. As you can guess, current day ended in 1993. So we're doing our best with the space that we have to try and condense down some of our storytelling so that we can still tell the history from the last 30 years. Because as we know, history doesn't end today. It keeps going. It keeps going on. And it's not, history isn't 50 years ago. History is yesterday. So we're still endeavoring with the space that we have, but hopefully you'll understand as we go through too, how we're hoping to expand that in the future as well, because we need to. As I mentioned in our conversation just before the program began, we only have 3% of the collection on display at any point in time, which means 97% of our objects and archival material are in storage. And it's not that we just put them in a box and put them in the basement. We do try and rotate them through. But they're also there for preservation's sake. We want to make sure that they're here for another 150 years. And so that's part of our calling. But it's also our endeavor to be able to share stories beyond the four walls of the museum itself. So that's why I welcome opportunities like today to talk to you about stories from our museum and put you into that historical context of hopefully of stories that you'll see in future programs too. As you can tell, we have two different galleries. I just kind of scrolled through those photos. And you can see that this is the 20th century gallery, where usually all the school kids lose their minds because we have tanks and planes and shiny things and lights. And so it's always a struggle, but we're actually I want to point out here before we get too far, I don't know if you can see my cursor there or not. The USS Wisconsin is that model, that battleship model in the bottom left of the photograph. We're going to talk about the Wisconsin because the Wisconsin plays a very important role in that Wisconsin was there moment during the first few hours, actually first few minutes of the Persian Gulf War. And of course, we have a Huey helicopter, which is another great interpretive tool to talk about. And you can see the scale of some of this material. But when you compare it with like a docent, for instance, who flew Huey helicopters during the Vietnam War, and you can understand what that helicopter really means so much better than through that conversation. And as you can see now, we've come around in the 20th century gallery, which is now the 21st century gallery as well, to the War on Terror section. This is where we ended our interpretation when the museum opened in 1993. You can actually see that we've condensed that now. Our interpretive panel had to be condensed from not just Persian Gulf, which you can see kind of there on the text panel if you've got good eyes there with Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm on the left. We also have Operation Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom on the right. And so we've condensed that story down simply because we're just out of space. We've got plenty of stories we'd love to be able to tell, but we just need the space to be able to tell them. So we're trying to find creative ways to rotate things through those cases to tell the story. So let's get right into it, talking about Persian Gulf. And when we think about Persian Gulf, you can kind of get a little confused. Is it Persian Gulf? Is it the Gulf War? Is it Desert Storm, Desert Shield? What's this Desert Saber? I don't know if anyone's ever heard of that. And so I like to discuss, how we name things is interesting, and is a whole different program for a whole different time. But you probably have heard of the Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. You may not have heard of Desert Saber or Desert Farewell or Desert Calm or Operation Granby, for instance. But one of the ones I want to point out here on this list is the 100 Hours War, because that's really what people understand as Persian Gulf, when in reality, it's a month-long engagement. It runs from August 2nd, 1990 through February, actually technically March 1st of 1991. However, most people consider Desert Shield to be the buildup, which it is, which lasts from August 2nd to the 16th of January. And that's the US operational name for the buildup of forces. But when you think of Persian Gulf, most people are going to think of Desert Storm, which is 17th of January through the 28th of February. Now, Desert Saber is the actual ground combat from the 24th to the 28th of February. And so I threw that one in there just a curveball. That'll hopefully be a trivia question someday that you may need to have in your back pocket. But it's the U.S. name for that air-land offensive against the Iraqi army in Kuwait that lasts actually 100 hours, which is why it's the 100-hour war from 24 February to 28 February. It's a component of Desert Storm. And then, of course, I want to also be sure we remember Operation Desert Farewell, which is actually the homecoming. It's also known as Operation Desert Calm, but it's the homecoming and the return of U.S. troops from Iraq and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. A lot of times, the study of military history ends with when the war ended. But for the veterans themselves, the story goes much farther than that. There is a homecoming, there is a return, and a sense of needing to return to normalcy. And what does that look like? And that's why at the Veterans Museum, we're not the War Museum, we're the Veterans Museum. We tell the entire story arc of a veteran, from when they're a kid and learning and going to school and what their interests were and what their favorite colors were, to why did they join? Were they forced to join? Did they volunteer to enlist? All the way through to when they discharge and reintegrate back into their civilian life, and what did they do after that? How did they do that? Were they able to do that? And then, of course, they're in those cases, where are they buried and why? So we try and tell that whole story arc. So that's why I want to point out that Desert Farewell is just as important as Desert Shield. It's that demobilization and that return home that doesn't get the appropriate understanding. Another fun trivia, if you really are interested, Operation Granby, which you can see there on the list, is actually the British name for the British military activities during the war. And Operation, I don't speak French, so forgive me, but it's Operation Daguet. I like to think it's like baguette, but it's not. Operation Daguet, which is the French name for French military operations. Operation Friction was the Canadian name. And of course, Operation Locust was the Italian name. And as with any other war or study of a conflict, there's always going to be notable statistics. It's one of those things that people always think of statistics when they think of military conflict, and that's good because it helps provide context too. So I want to just briefly go through these. I know I'm talking much longer than I thought I would about some of this. So some of the things, you think of the firsts in conflict. And for the Persian Gulf War, this is the first conflict that has wide-scale international live broadcast coverage, where you're literally interrupting the nightly news, especially during Operation Desert Storm, the air war part of it, to have a reporter who's in Baghdad and there's cruise missiles going off in the background. There's a famous story of one reporter who says all's quiet here as the ultimatum, the date of the ultimatum expires. And during the live broadcast, I think it was with, I want to say Dan Rather, he signs off saying all's quiet, nothing's happening here, only to within 5 minutes pull it right back in and say, actually, no. And all of a sudden there's a giant explosion right behind him as a cruise missile goes right down the street and hits the Ministry of Defense building in Baghdad. So it's a whole different ballgame now when you have that international live broadcast coverage like you do with this conflict. Another first is you have the first use really in this scale of precision guided munitions, which is a whole different ballgame for combat. It's the first use for GPS units really to assist with unit location and identification. AWACS, which are those giant planes with the discs on top of them, the first real true deployment of using that at such a large scale for command and control. We'll talk about that a little bit here when we talk about the air war. The first use of Patriot missiles in combat, primarily in response to the Scud missile attacks used by Iraq against Israel, but also against the troops that are stationing in Saudi Arabia. It wasn't exactly the first use of stealth fighters and bombers, but at least at this scale it was. So if you remember some of the images that came out in the 90s through the no-fly zones over Iraq, there were a lot of images of those F-117 Nighthawks, those stealth fighter bombers. And they actually flew one or two missions in the 80s. But in honesty, within the first few days, they'd already flown over 1,000 missions with over 6,900 hours of flight time by the end of the combat period. And that just shows you this massive experiment almost that the Persian Gulf War was. It is the last conflict that battleships were used. That's where we talk about the USS Wisconsin, originally built for World War II, retrofitted at least 2 or 3 times in its career. It was brought out of retirement just before the conflict and retrofitted with cruise missiles, the ability to fire cruise missiles, which will be instrumental here in the opening hours of the conflict. It's the largest, let's say. It's the largest coalition since World War II. 39 countries sent forces to fight here during the war on the Allied coalition side. That amounted to over 950,000 coalition troops. Now, the United States provided about 73% of that. In 1988, another largest, Iraq's army in 1988 was the 4th largest in the world coming out of the Iraq-Iran wars. So it's not a substantial, or it's a substantial enemy that they're building up against. In the first few hours of the war, the sheer volume of aircraft, 2,230 coalition aircraft are in operation out of Saudi Arabia air bases. 6 entire carrier groups are deployed during Desert Shield. And that's a significant amount. If you've ever seen those photographs, and I'll use one here later, of the size of those carriers. We've got a great story of someone who was on one of those carriers and who didn't think it was possible to even have that many carriers all in one place because of the size of the Gulf, much less the size of the aircraft carriers. But it did happen. We have the longest bombing raid in history to that point. 7 B-52 bombers actually took off from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana and struck targets in Iraq within the first few minutes of the war, and then returned without landing. It is the longest bombing raid in history that they were able to leave the United States, drop off munitions and deposit their payload in Iraq and return without landing ever. It took them 36 hours. But by the time they got back, it was a demonstration, obviously, of that United States being able to touch wherever it needed to in the world. And fewest. The fewest is not usually a historical statistic that we really talk about when we talk about conflict. But I think this one is of note because it's actually this conflict has, other than combat operations in Somalia and Panama and Grenada, the Persian Gulf War actually has the fewest Wisconsin deaths out of any conflict that we've been part of. And that's something of note, I think. And we'll talk a little bit about that. How I mentioned that of those, 10,400 Wisconsinites that served, in the Persian Gulf, only 11 died, which is actually quite remarkable, all things considered. So we also talk about, when we talk about history, talk about dates, of course, and maps. I love maps. But this map shows you a great example of those coalition forces and where they all came from and how they were all dispersed. But we also talk about time. We talk about timelines and where does this all fall to help provide us that idea of context too. So this all begins, of course, 2nd of August, when about 100,000 Iraqi troops invade Kuwait. It's actually a culmination of a few months of issues that have arisen between relationships with Iraq and Kuwait. In fact, it's a culmination of years of tension. But in particular, in 1990, it was about oil production and the amount of oil that Kuwait was producing and providing to the Western world, if you will, was actually causing economic distress and potential collapse in Iraq. And so Iraq invaded Kuwait. And there's a whole series of things, and I can go into lengthy detail if anyone has questions, but there's a whole series of events, and Iraq ends up invading Kuwait to cease their oil production, but also to claim territory that they claim belonged to them. That same day, the United Nations Security Council condemns the Iraqi invasion with a resolution. The next day, August 3rd, President Bush announces the U.S. Navy, that he's deploying U.S. Navy ships to the Persian Gulf. Only a few days later, on the 6th, the United Nations Security Council issues a resolution and starts implementing sanctions against Iraq. On the 6th of August as well, the Secretary of Defense at the time, Dick Cheney, meets with the King of Saudi Arabia to discuss sending U.S. armed troops to defend Saudi Arabia in case of an Iraqi invasion. The next day, the 7th of August, 15,000 U.S. troops and 32 destroyers, 100 helicopters and fighter jets arrive in Saudi Arabia. So it's only within a few days of the 5 days of the Iraqi invasion that you already have that many troops and forces starting to compile in Saudi Arabia. Operation Desert Shield is officially announced on the 8th of August, 6 days after the initial invasion. On the 9th of August, Security Council Resolution 662 condemns the Iraqi invasion once again. On the 10th of August, the Arab League actually issues a statement condemning the invasion and calls on Iraq to withdraw troops. The same day, they actually vote to send troops to the Gulf region to support Kuwait against Iraq. The naval blockade begins on the 12th of August. Naval ships are ordered by Secretary Dick Cheney to seize all ships and cargo leaving and entering Iraq and Kuwait. 18th of August, another UN security resolution demanding that Iraq leave Kuwait. 25th of August, more sanctions are employed. By the 26th of August, Iraq has actually either seized or is sieging the foreign embassies in Kuwait City. And finally, on the 28th of August, Kuwait is formally annexed by Iraq. On the 9th of September, President Bush actually meets with Soviet Union, the president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, in Helsinki to discuss the Iraqi invasion. I think it's actually within months of the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is a remarkable event that they actually meet to discuss the Iraqi invasion, and both come to the same conclusion, to condemn the Iraqi invasion and demand that Iraq leave. On the 11th of September, and that's an important date, as we know later on, but on the 11th of September, President George H.W. Bush, in an address to a joint session of Congress, issues conditions that Iraq must withdraw from Kuwait completely. It's interesting how dates in history line up sometimes, but we'll talk about that at the end of our presentation. On the 14th of September, the United Kingdom and France start sending troops. Another UN resolution by the end of the month. In September, by middle of October, there are 200,000 American troops, 15,000 British troops, and 11,000 French troops in the Gulf area. In November, U.S. Announces that they'll send even more troops. About 100,000 troops begin to arrive to support the existing 220,000 troops already there. By the end of November, just after Thanksgiving, The UN passes yet another resolution, and this one is the key one. It requires that Iraq withdraw from Kuwait before January 15th, 1991, or face military action. And that brings us roughly up to January. By January 12th, which was only 30 years ago, a couple days ago, the US Congress passed a joint resolution authorizing the use of military force in Iraq and Kuwait. The votes were actually 52 to 47 in the Senate and 250 to 183 in the House of Representatives. It's actually, up to that point, the closest margin to authorizing force by the US Congress since the War of 1812. Another tidbit note that you may need or may never need for bar trivia, depending on what you do on your free time. And by 15th of January, so tomorrow, 30 years ago tomorrow, 580,000 coalition troops are stationed in the Gulf region, opposing 540,000 Iraqi troops, and the ultimatum expires. And as we know with history, only 2 days later, the Operation Desert Storm, which is the first air attacks of the coalition forces, begins within hours. The first salvo to actually fire to essentially launch the war comes from the USS Wisconsin. The USS Wisconsin is the battleship, is in the Persian Gulf, and it is coordinating the cruise missile launches of the naval squadron in the Persian Gulf. And those cruise missiles land to the minute of when the H hour was designed. Also within a couple minutes of H hour, which is the moment that the attack starts, those B-52s that had launched from Barksdale Air Force Base end up launching their missiles as well and returning home. They had already been in the air for over 2/3 of a day and already refueled several times. But all of this was coordinated so that within only a few minutes of H hour, all of this was happening. And as we know then, January into February actually is a series of events back and forth. Iraq will launch several Scud missiles into Israeli cities. The US deploys more Patriot missiles into Israel and Saudi Arabia. And there's just every day is more aerial combat or aerial strikes. There is actually some resistance. The Iraqi Air Force does launch several aircraft. They are shot down almost immediately upon contact, but not in all cases. But it does. January and at least the first half of February is truly an air war. As we move in to the 22nd of January, I want to point this out, is when the first oil fields, perhaps this is an image that may look familiar if people remember seeing this from 1991. There are over 600, actually by the end of it, there'll be over 700 oil fields that are set alight by Iraqi forces. And they burn from January 22nd until the last one wasn't extinguished until November of 1991. So it was a substantial amount of time when these first oil fields were lit. Now that brings us into February. And February, the month of February, predominantly again is more airstrikes, but we also see by the 22nd of February, President H.W. Bush has issued a 24-hour ultimatum. Iraq must withdraw from Kuwait, otherwise the ground war will begin. As soon as that ultimatum expires on the 24th of February at around 4 a.m. Baghdad time, US-led coalition forces invade Iraq and Kuwait. On the 25th of February, that next day, 20,000 Iraqi troops surrender to the coalition. By the end of the month, but by the end of the next 2 days, there'll be over 100,000 Iraqi troops that have surrendered. On the same day, Iraq also launches Scud missile attacks into Saudi Arabia, which kills 28 American troops and injures 98 civilians. And by the 26th of February, only 100 hours later, President of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, announces that Iraq will withdraw from Kuwait totally and accept the UN resolution's terms. He doesn't renounce, however, Iraqi claim over Kuwait. That day, 10,000 retreating Iraqi troops are killed during their retreat from Kuwait in what has been known or become known as the Highway of Death. I won't show pictures of that, but it is a fairly famous picture of the destroyed vehicles along the one highway leading out of Kuwait back towards Iraq. And of course, by the 27th, US Marines and Saudi Arabian troops have entered Kuwait City. That same day, the 101st Airborne Division is less than 150 miles from Baghdad. They have advanced and completely cut off the retreat of the Iraqi forces. Later that day, President Bush announces that the liberation of Kuwait is coming to an end and that cessation of hostilities will end, or cessation of hostilities will go into effect at 0400. Essentially announcing that the war is coming to an end. The operations were successful in what they were meant to do. It has only been 100 hours, but it is a complete and utter success, is how it's phrased. And we'll talk a little bit about the experiences of some people within that time, that 100 hour. And as we look at photographs, we've seen a lot of those famous pictures today, but I like to point out some of the personal pictures in our collection. As you look, again, we're looking at details of photographs. You'll notice there that Wisconsin flag flying right by the 826 Ordnance companies out of Madison, Wisconsin, their command post. And so we're going to talk about some of that Wisconsin connection, other than the USS Wisconsin, of course. John Peters is a story that we have great oral history from, and I want to go through his photographs. He's got an amazing photograph collection from Persian Gulf, but he was eager to join the Army. In fact, that he was so eager that he actually joined before his high school graduation, and his diploma arrived while he was in basic training. And in 1990, he was, of course, deployed to the Persian Gulf as part of Operation Desert Shield, and served in Saudi Arabia along the Iraqi border as one of those distractions to show not necessarily to give away where the attack was coming from. But finally, his unit did go into Iraq as a distraction from the main thrust through Kuwait. And his photographs are great. You can see we've got photographs, like I said, we try and cover the whole story arc of the veteran. Here we've got him during basic training, graduation, and then we of course have a lot of photographs from his service in country. John there is on the left with his comrade with some captured enemy materiel. There's John standing in front of his Bradley vehicle. You can see, and it really kind of captures that downtime experience too. But I love going back in and looking at the details of what gear are they storing where and why. Another great photo from his collection is detonating the mines in the area. And of course, another great photo of his whole crew on top of their Bradley fighting vehicle. Now, you may have noticed something fairly prominent in a couple of his photos. And it just so happens to be the center point of this photo, which I absolutely love because there's a wonderful story behind it. In fact, in his oral history, he talks about it, and I'll just read his quote here. I think you probably saw one of the things that I prided the most while I was over there was the Wisconsin flag that I donated to the museum. I had my mother ship that to me in October, maybe November, and that thing flew in Saudi Arabia and Iraq. Everywhere our vehicle stopped, it went on the antenna pole. Part of it was Wisconsin pride, but also you've got 12 Bradley fighting vehicles. Which ones? Unless you look at the bumper, look at the number, you don't know which one is yours. Oh yeah, Wisconsin flag. There you go. If you're sitting in a tent it went on their pole. So I've got a million pictures of me with it. When I got back, I was like, okay, let's donate this. It has to have a proper home. And that's it there. So that is one of my personal favorite artifacts that we have in our collection. Not only is it the flag itself, but we actually have the photographs of him documenting his experience with that flag. Oral histories are a great way of capturing and helping to tell stories as well. In fact, it's one of my favorites. One of the things that I always say at the museum is that the veterans are the voice. We're just the microphone. We want to get those voices out there as much as possible. So I'll use a couple quotes here from John Shear, who's on the USS Ranger, one of those carriers that I talked about. When they were talking about Desert Shield, he said he found out about that they were going essentially from CNN, because they had CNN on board. He was already on board. And so the interviewer asked, how'd you find out where you were going? And he said, oh yeah, we were going there for Desert Shield. They said it could escalate. They didn't know what was going to happen. So we trained all the way across to see how fast we could load bombs. And we had to load. We were loading 1,000-pound bombs by hand, and we had to see how fast we could do it. That's how we trained all the way across. And I'm glad they made us do it. And when asked what did he do during the buildup, because they were there before the air war began, obviously. And he said, we were usually doing normal everyday ops. You know, pilots are flying over and checking, making sure that everything's going fine, because, you know, presence again and floating around in the Gulf waiting, they finally gave us the order to go. And so when asked what was one of the most favorite visuals that he had, or one of the most vivid visuals that he had in his mind, of what he saw, considering the grand logistics of getting all these carriers in one place. And he says, the best of what I did see, though, is they have a picture of it, is that all 4 carriers made it inside the Gulf. They said it could never happen because the Gulf wasn't big enough for the 4 carriers. And so the fact that there's this famous photograph of all 4 carriers operating there, and that was one of those magnitude things that he saw, that sheer scale of that mobilization, stuck in his head. And this is one of those other favorite photos that I have. It's a public domain image, but this is the coming home of the USS Ranger. So we know that somewhere on there that we have our dear friend Mr. Shear. But when he was asked, you know, in terms of public support and yellow ribbons and the writing campaigns, what did he remember? You know, this is a really big initiative during this conflict. And he says that it was the best help we could ever get. It was fantastic, especially the letters from the kids from around the country. And we'd answer them, you know. I knew a guy that didn't have anybody to write to, and he took 4 or 5 of them, you know, just to get mail, actually. But, you know, the care packages that used to send homemade cookies and candy, stuff from home, even old magazines or newspapers that they rolled up to keep the fruit in. We read them, you know, just stuff from home and having that connection to home. I really love that quote, talking about that connection from home. Helen Gurkow is another great story. And I'll just quickly, I'm running out of time, so I'll abbreviate her story dramatically. But I'll want to point out that imagery that we all remember from the Persian Gulf War. And the interviewer asked her, you know, on the home front, what were your thoughts about yellow ribbons and that sort of thing? Were you aware that there were yellow ribbons being circulated? And she said, oh yes, we were aware there, because up at Fort McCoy, where they had gathered before deployment, there's a group of trees right by the entrance. I don't know, there must be 15 trees there or so. They had a yellow flag on there for every unit, and the flag stayed there until that unit came back and was demobilized out of McCoy. The interviewer asked, like, as you were leaving, did you know they were there? And said, we knew the flag was there, yes. I mean, the ribbon was there. This is the great part of this war, because of the support they got from home. I honestly think that they got that support because they had the Guard units mobilized with it. I don't think they would have gotten that kind of support from active duty, because active duty people don't have as much community connection as the Guard does. There's just another photo of Helen there. Now, I brought up some of those points early on because the war necessarily, yes, we know the war ends in 100 days or 100 hours. But in reality, we know for sure that history is a continuum. It doesn't just magically end and everything goes back to normal the way it was before. So one of the themes that we're telling this year and helping to connect the history is this year not only is the 30th anniversary of Persian Gulf, it's also the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And I bring that up because, yes, there's 10 years that separate the two, but when we actually look at the military operations that happened between the Persian Gulf War and Operation Enduring Freedom, or the attack in 9/11, there is a significant amount that are still that were still happening in Iraq. Roughly roughly a third of all military operations in the 90s were to deal directly with or in reaction to Iraq. So you can see here just from this list alone of how many were actually involved still there. So even though, yes, the war did end, it didn't really end necessarily. In fact, you could say we never truly left in many ways before 9/11. And I can go into, and if there's any questions about those, we can answer those at the end, but I don't need to bore you with all that. But what I will leave you with is that this understanding that history is all interconnected. And I don't just necessarily mean the dates and the timelines and the statistics, which is what we talked about a lot today, but hopefully you also saw a glimmer of that humanity behind the history, those faces behind the facts, because you have to have context to understand the impact of these experiences, but you also have to have an understanding of the human cost and the human interaction with that history. It's not isolated. It's not just a neat chapter in a book that you can end the story here and that's where it goes, because it all is related. And it really is that face behind the fact, or the humanity behind the history, that really brings it home for all of us. And so with that, I'll end my portion of the conversation, but I'd love to actually stick around and chat with anyone who'd like to.
Does anybody have any questions or comments or anything for Kevin today? I know I learned some facts that I never knew, although I feel like I'm always learning facts I never knew when it comes to history. I'm not going to lie. I feel like I appreciate it more now in life than I did when I was actually learning some of these things in school.
Yeah. I think there's a difference when you study history, because you have to, and you have to memorize it.
Yeah.
And I think our understanding of history is it's affected by that, because you're told, study this date and what happened on this date. But that's not necessarily, yes, it's history. It's the facts, it's the statistics, and you need that as your base. But what is studying history? Studying history is trying to learn more, the desire to dig deeper, to find those connections. So I always caution people when they think of history, it's not at all what you thought of in grade school or high school or college, because that's where they're going to get you to try and memorize those facts, so that hopefully you can do that digging deeper and that finding those interconnected in the cause and effects later on.
Anybody else?
What's everyone's favorite era of history?
Yeah, I was just going to say.
What's everyone's, I mean, I've done this before. I've asked what people's favorite color is. I don't know. Favorite era of history, go.
Lauren's got one. I can tell she's thinking over there.
I'm thinking, yeah. Give me a second.
I was thinking 1930s stuff kind of intrigues me. I love learning about the Holocaust. I mean, I love some of the current stuff too, though, like 9/11. And I mean, my kiddos, that's kind of what they know. So I do find I'm focusing on things that maybe have happened in the last 15 years, just because that's kind of what they're learning about. But I love World War II stuff.
Yeah.
It's sometimes eerie to think of some of the stuff that's repeating itself when you read that stuff. Yep. So that's me, but somebody else can go.
I was just thinking how we're constantly living through history too, especially with this last year and creating it. And we don't think about that too often.
Exactly. And that's part of that. History isn't passive.
Yeah.
It's not just something on a page.
Yeah, several years ago, we visited with my siblings, the museum, and our dad was in the Battle of the Bulge. I don't know if you still have that exhibit up.
We do, yeah, the diorama.
But that was very, I mean, several of us had tears in our eyes just looking at that, knowing, that our dad was there.
Yeah.
So yeah, World War II Civil War is very fascinating too, especially in light of today.
Right. And that's where you could argue too, have we ever really gotten over it? Have we ever,
Right.
I don't think anyone would
Right.
say that
I
we
don't
have.
think we have. No.
Yeah.
With the Battle of the Bulge, I have to ask. There is a debate. In the industry, the history industry, if you will, museum field, whatever you want to call it. Mannequins or no mannequins in a museum?
Oh.
So diorama or no diorama, essentially. Or you could do it without a mannequin too.
I really like the diorama and the mannequins. I think that
Okay.
brings it to life, rather than just shelves with helmets and weapons.
Right.
It's like, yeah.
Ooh, that's a good question.
It's not one that anyone has. There's not a right or wrong answer. It's all personal preference. But from an interpretation side of things, like presenting it so people can digest it, I couldn't go to a museum that didn't have a diorama or a mannequin.
Right.
Now, some mannequins, I won't lie, depending on your budget, some mannequins can be really creepy.
I was just going to say, some of the mannequins can be a little creepy, but I like the mannequins too, but sometimes, yeah, they're a little creepy.
And it's all, I think, in the quality. If it looks enough to give you context, I think that's why they're there. They're meant to give you context. But if they're like faceless or they're really not great quality, it can really pull you out of that immersive context understanding. So there's good and bad, I think, but it all depends.
I went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and the one room I remember there is the shoe room. And that has never left my memory.
Yep.
So that's not mannequins, but yeah, it's still.
Yep.
I swore when I walked in there, I could smell the shoes.
Yep. There's what I want to do in the new museum. We've been working on a new museum for 10 years. And I was helping design it when we were first starting the project, and now the project's been paused for 5 years. But either way, one of the building rooms in the new museum I want to do is a wall of dog tags for every single Wisconsinite that is served. And then have a different color for those that died. So like a red dog tag or something like that, just to see that scale. Because that's the problem with statistics in history. You just can't visualize it. I'll give you an example with like, let's do Camp Randall. So Camp Randall is a great way to learn about Wisconsin Civil War. One, because it's a training camp during the Civil War. But two, how many people fit in Camp Randall? Anybody know?
A lot.
roughly 82,000, about 83 depending, but they're bringing it back down with their new projects to 82. 81,000 serve in Wisconsin during the Civil War. So now if you've ever been to a Badger game, imagine all those people are the sheer number of people that served in the Civil War. Even better, if you've ever been to a Badger game, especially the early ones on Saturday mornings, you know that the student section is never full at 11 a.m. One, because what college kid is going to get there beforehand or be awake? But also two, the way that they're admitted. But either way, that section that is missing from that full stadium is roughly about 13,000, 14,000 students. How many people don't come home from the state of Wisconsin from the Civil War? About 12,000. So the next time you see Camp Randall, especially at the beginning of a game, and if you're watching from home and you pan across it and you see that gap missing, it's a beautiful, beautiful representation of that statistic of 81,000 that serve in the state of Wisconsin in the Civil War, 12,000 don't come home. Camp Randall holds 82,000 people, 13,000 are the student section.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, visual context of it.
Yeah.
And that's why I like that shoe room. You just get that imagery, you get that feeling, you can see the number, and just you can read about it. You can even watch the documentaries, the live, the actual recorded imagery from like Auschwitz or something, but you don't understand it until you get that three-dimensional experience of going in that room. And I think, if I remember correctly, I think each shoe represents a number.
Yeah, I can't remember.
I can't remember the exact ratio.
Look it up. And again, I went to that my senior year in high school.
Yeah.
But
and that's something that
I would
stayed
love
with
to
you.
go back.
Yeah. It's those images that stay with you that you know it really had an impact.
I think it's important to read about history. I would like to see more people in my generation doing that, because I know my grandparents are really good about it. I don't want to, I think we need to learn more about history and pass it down to our kids and talk about how important it is. I just really do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not been a priority, I'll say, in policy, in education policy, in schooling, in standardized testing, obviously, for a long time. And I think humanities as a whole, you're seeing that trend. But it's almost implying that humanities don't have a place in the future, which is so wrong. And we know that, of course, because we're all listening to the same presentation. But you have to have that human element. Otherwise you lose that grounding, that understanding of the impact of the science and the math.
Well, Kevin, I know you have to scoot, so I just want to say thank you. Thank you to everybody that came today. Thank you for Kevin. Thank you for presenting, and I hope we can have you back for another Zoom in the future.
Next time we can have more of a conversation. I promise. I won't.
Oh no, yeah, fine. That's good. All right. Well, everybody have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.